opening lines to the center, aspiring to seize immediate board control and create attacking pathways. Opens a fierce battle for central space, immediately challenging white's pawn with asymmetrical pressure. Initiating piece development and staking a claim in the center, this knight jump prepares for pawn advances and potential kingside attacks. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing for bishop development, this move signals intent for a robust Sicilian defense setup. Initiating pawn thrust to challenge central dominance and immediately open lines. Opening the central diagonal for the queen's bishop immediately is a bold tactical decision, potentially creating dynamic imbalances. Instantly activating the knight, white seizes central influence and prepares for swift development, posing immediate questions about black's pawn structure. Developing the knight here challenges white's central pawn immediately, creating a dynamic fight for space and potential counterplay on the kingside. A solid developing maneuver, reinforcing the central pawn and preparing to cast IE. Securing the b5 square proactively prevents white's knight from landing there, anticipating future queenside pressure. Developing the bishop to e2 gracefully prepares castling, harmonizing the pieces by connecting the rooks and securing the king's safety, while simultaneously eyeing the center and potentially supporting a future kingside pawn advance. Asserting central presence, black challenges white's knight and aims to establish a pawn foothold, forcing a strategic decision about the pawn structure and the control of key squares. Safeguarding the knight's forward placement, this retreat subtly shifts the pressure, aiming to maintain control of key central squares and prepare for potential kingside expansion or a solid defensive structure. This move secures the bishop and prepares for castling, reinforcing the pawn structure while subtly challenging white's central influence. Unpinning the knight with a subtle threat of pressure on the kingside. This move aims to break black's pawn chain and potentially disrupt their development, forcing a decision regarding the knight on f6. White seeks to exploit the current pawn structure, aiming for a more dynamic middle game where their pieces can coordinate effectively towards black's king. It's a prophylactic measure, preparing for future central advances or potential piece exchanges that could favor white. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies the kingside pawn structure and prepares for a potential queenside expansion, while also offering support for the e5 pawn. Sensing a slight imbalance, white proactively addresses the central pawn structure, aiming to prevent black's potential queenside expansion and gain a foothold for the knight on b3. This move, seemingly simple, prepares to clamp down on the b5 square and potentially establish a dominant outpost, while subtly challenging black's pieces to find better squares. Securing the king's safety is paramount, and this castling maneuver immediately shelters your monarch behind a pawn wall, preparing for a more active middle game engagement. The king tucks away, securing a crucial safety measure as the queenside pawn advance begins to exert pressure. Seeking to prevent the knight from jumping to g5 and disrupting the kingside structure, black offers a pawn sacrifice to create space for their pieces, a common theme in these Sicilian structures when white attempts to build a central presence. This pawn move signals a potential pawn storm on the queenside or a desire to open lines for counterplay. It forces white to make a decision about how to respond to this immediate threat, influencing the ensuing piece play. Retreating the bishop to g5, and then back to h4 strategically retargets the now doubled pawns on the queenside, aiming to create lasting weaknesses should black decide to recapture with a pawn. This repositioning subtly prepares for potential pawn breaks later on, while simultaneously keeping an eye on the central squares, forcing black to consider the bishop's pressure. Consider the long-term implications. This bishop, initially an attacking piece, now transitions to a more defensive, yet still active role ready to influence key diagonals and prepare for pawn advances. The maneuver might seem passive, but it's a sophisticated positional adjustment, building pressure and restricting black's piece mobility without immediately creating tactical fireworks. Think of it as a carefully calibrated repositioning, where white patiently waits for black to reveal intentions, all while their bishop maintains a quiet yet persistent threat. Instead of directly challenging the central tension, black opts for a subtle maneuver, reinforcing the queenside pawn structure and preparing to challenge white's active bishop. This move, b6, subtly aims to contest the dark squares, specifically the c5 square, potentially limiting white's knight, and offering a safe haven for the queenside pawns should white's central control falter. It's a building block for future queenside expansion, a quiet statement of intent to develop an initiative on that flank while ensuring defensive solidity. White boldly stakes a claim on the central diagonal, aiming to pressure black's king while simultaneously preparing for further queenside expansion, with the c3 knight finding a more active posting. Reclaiming the center and preparing a kingside castling is a solid response, aiming to solidify the king's safety and develop the bishop to a more active square, eyeing the d4 knight. Unlocking a queenside expansion becomes the immediate focus, preparing to challenge the central pawn structure and potentially open lines towards black's castled monarch. Unlocking the queenside potential, this maneuver simultaneously bolsters the pawn structure against potential knight incursions, while preparing to join the central battle through potential pawn breaks or redeployments, hinting at a subtle shift towards a more active piece play. Positioning a rook on the d-file, aiming for central influence and potentially opening lines for subsequent attacks, demonstrates a commitment to active piece play and preparing for potential pawn pushes later in the game. Black reinforces the d-file, preparing to contest it directly and preventing white's rook from finding easy entry to the c-file. Preparing to potentially pivot the knight towards the kingside, perhaps aiming for f1 and then g3 to add pressure. Pushing the g-pawn here creates significant pawn tension on the kingside, a bold attempt to gain space and potentially dislodge the vigilant bishop on h4. But it also weakens the light squares around the king and invites counterplay if black can't consolidate their new pawn's advanced positions. Unveiling white's bishop to g3 sharpens the diagonal pressure on black's queenside, aiming to exploit the semi-open c-file and potentially trap the active dark-squared bishop. This repositioning not only develops a piece towards its active potential, but also prepares for a potential kingside initiative by clearing the path for other pieces to join the attack, while simultaneously forcing black to consider the safety of his king's pawn structure. A bold reorientation of the knight, aiming to redeploy it to a more active square, likely f6, to challenge white's central control and prepare for further kingside expansion or a queenside initiative, depending on white's response. Fortifying the king's defense while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn breaks on the kingside, this move establishes a more robust structure, albeit potentially creating a slight weakness on the e3 square. The knight embarks on a surprising journey to e6, subtly challenging white's control of the d4 square and potentially aiming to reroute to a more active position, perhaps c7 or even d8 if the e-file becomes contested. This maneuver, while appearing passive initially, seeks to untangle black's queenside and offer flexibility, setting the stage for a potential regrouping or even a tactical strike if white underestimates the latent potential of this seemingly quiet repositioning. Observe how this placement aims to disrupt white's harmonious development and prepare for future skirmishes on the central squares. Shifting the bishop to f2 untangles the f3 pawn's defensive duties, allowing it to support a potential kingside advance, and preparing the queen to redeploy to a more active square, perhaps to pressure black's queenside pawn structure or support a central pawn push. Recentering the monarch is a prudent maneuver, subtly shoring up the king's defenses against any potential kingside assaults by reinforcing its pawn shield and creating a safer haven from the lurking bishop on g3. The king's repositioning to h1 subtly reinforces the queenside structure and prepares for potential kingside pawn advances, while simultaneously creating a safe haven from any immediate diagonal threats originating from black's bishop on b7. A bold thrust, *nf4* ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially create attacking chances on the kingside. This knight sacrifice, if accepted, opens lines for black's remaining forces, though it leaves the king somewhat exposed to white's active bishops. The positional risk is tangible. However, the potential reward of breaking white's pawn structure and seizing the initiative makes it an intriguing gambit. Transitioning the queen to the queenside opens up possibilities for rapid pawn advancements, potentially creating a powerful attacking lever against black's slightly passive setup. This gambit-like pawn thrust explodes the center, immediately creating significant tension and forcing white to make difficult decisions about piece placement and pawn structure. Black's objective is clear: disrupt white's harmonious development and open lines for his pieces, particularly the rooks, while simultaneously challenging the d4 square. The subsequent capture will likely lead to a dynamic imbalance, where black aims to exploit the open files and potential weaknesses in white's kingside after white recaptures. This aggressive maneuver underscores black's proactive approach, seeking to seize the initiative and dictate the flow of the game rather than passively defending. Opening the d-file decisively, this exchange initiates a sharp tactical phase where piece activity will be paramount. Consider how the newly opened file will immediately influence the placement and scope of your rooks, potentially creating new attacking avenues or defending against black's expanding central presence. The pawn structure has irrevocably changed, creating a dynamic rather than static battleground. The bishop's maneuver to c5 strategically contests the d4 square and offers a potential outpost for the knight, while simultaneously preparing to eye the white king's shelter on the kingside. Shifting the queen from the open e-file offers a flexible retreat, preparing to redeploy it to a more active square on the kingside or support a central pawn push after black's central tension resolves. A fascinating exchange unfolds, fundamentally altering the pawn structure and opening up critical lines. The absorption of white's bishop by black's bishop not only clears the e6 square for black's knight, but also creates a permanent pawn duel on the d-file. This sacrifice of material, while seemingly minor, promises significant compensation in terms of dynamic play and potential kingside pressure. White must now carefully consider how to utilize the newly acquired open files, while black seeks to exploit the weakened central structure and potentially launch a swift attack against the white king. Reclaiming the queen with qxf2 solidifies white's central presence and prepares for further development, but it also creates a slight weakness on the light squares if black manages to exploit them with well-timed pawn breaks. The immediate threat of the queen on f2 does force black to react, preventing any immediate tactical incursions on that wing. Yet the exchange has gifted black a more active bishop on c5, which now eyes the white king's defenses more directly. This reshuffle also opens up the possibility of white targeting the d5 pawn, or reinforcing the f3 pawn with g4 in the future, depending on black's next choice, making the ensuing position quite dynamic. The pawn sacrifice on d5 unleashes a dynamic counterplay, aiming to shatter white's central pawn structure and activate black's pieces, particularly the bishop on b7, which now sees a clearer diagonal. A bold attempt to reclaim the initiative, repositioning the knight to a more active square, aiming to disrupt black's seemingly solid central pawn structure and potentially exploit the slightly weakened kingside. Injecting immediate central pressure, this aggressive pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's harmony and seize initiative on the open d-file, potentially forcing concessions or creating tactical opportunities. Navigating the ensuing chaos, white strategically repositions the knight to the more active g3 square, aiming to bolster the kingside defense and prepare for potential advances on the central files. A bold repositioning, aiming to activate the rook on an open file and potentially challenge white's control over the d-file. A strategic redeployment, the bishop shifts to actively contest the long diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's central control and potentially create weaknesses around the king. Finally bringing the rook to a more active file, the Re8 advance immediately eyes the open d-file, creating potential pressure on white's knight and queen should they remain passively positioned, and it cleverly prepares to support a central pawn push or bolster the kingside defense by offering a rook lift maneuver. A repositioning maneuver initiates, the knight vacating the center to potentially access richer diagonals or to provide support for an anticipated pawn thrust on the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's well-entrenched pieces and exploit any overextensions. Pushing the h-pawn creates a fascinating tension, potentially opening lines on the kingside while simultaneously weakening the pawn structure around the monarch. It's a daring attempt to inject dynamism into a position that has been slowly developing, aiming to create counterplay by challenging white's bishop and potentially creating an outpost for black's knights. The knight sacrifices itself in a bold gambit, aiming to disrupt black's tightly knit pawn structure and potentially expose the king. This aggressive thrust, while sacrificing material, forces black to make immediate decisions, potentially leading to tactical complications or a swift shift in the initiative. Observe how the king's defense is suddenly put to the test. Exposing the king further is a daring gamble, but the goal is likely to disrupt white's piece coordination and create counterplay, even at the cost of immediate safety. Swapping off a knight here dramatically alters the pawn structure, potentially opening the king's defenses in the long run, even if immediate attacks aren't apparent. The tactical exchange might seem simple, but its consequence is to simplify the material while creating new attacking avenues for white's remaining pieces, especially the queen and bishop, on the weakened king side. Black's king, having just moved to a more central position, now faces an environment where its protective shield has been thinned, demanding extreme vigilance. The capture on f4 shatters white's kingside pawn shield, exposing the monarch to potential future attacks and opening lines that were previously well defended. A daring pawn sacrifice to dismantle the opponent's central pawn chain is undertaken, hoping to exploit the open lines and create dynamic counterplay. Unleashing the pawn storm on the king side, black seeks to shatter white's defensive structure and open lines toward the enemy monarch, a bold gambit that inherently carries risk but promises significant attacking potential. Shifting the knight to a more passive square, e2, concedes crucial central space and neglects the immediate pressure black is building on the king side, effectively inviting further advances from the opponent's g-pawn, potentially exposing the white king to a dangerous assault. A bold sacrifice is initiated, aiming to shatter white's pawn shield around the king and expose it to immediate danger. Sacrificing the king to eliminate a critical defensive piece, a bold gamble for material superiority and an exposed enemy monarch, hoping to exploit the open lines created by black's aggressive pawn push. This decisive pawn thrust rips open the king's defense, exploiting the weakened g-file and threatening immediate checkmate after the recapture. Shifting the monarch to the only secure square offers a vital breathing room, as the relentless g-pawn advance has drastically weakened the kingside defenses, leaving the monarch exposed to potential discovered attacks and tactical traps orchestrated by black's active pieces. Unleashing the pawn storm, black boldly pushes forward, seeking to tear open white's king's defenses and exploit the newly created diagonal for the dark-squared bishop. Unleashing a sudden check across the board, white aims to disrupt black's aggressively advanced pawn structure and expose their king, which currently feels quite exposed by that looming knight. A bold gambit to seize initiative on the king side, sacrificing a pawn for a tempestuous attack where open files will soon dictate fate. A brilliant forcing move, igniting fireworks around the black king by exploiting the open diagonal and the pinned knight. The black king, exposed by the recent pawn sacrifice, is now a sitting duck under a powerful discovered attack, forcing an immediate retreat to a slightly less perilous square. This rook maneuver seizes the open 7th rank, a potent gateway for future attacks, and a stifling presence that severely restricts black's king and pieces. Sacrificing the bishop opens up a vital diagonal for your king, but the exposed nature of your monarch becomes a pressing concern as your opponent's queen now commands a terrifying sweep across the board, directly targeting your king's immediate vicinity. The monarch's desperate flight through the chaos of the queen side has finally led him to a precarious refuge on the king side, a decision born of necessity as the enemy rooks loom menacingly over open files. The queen dives into the heart of white's position, creating immediate threats on the now open c2 square and aiming to disrupt the newly coordinated pieces. This aggressive maneuver forces white to decide between defending the vulnerable king or maintaining material advantage. Unleashing a dazzling discovered check, the white queen orchestrates a brutal assault on the exposed black monarch, forcing a quick resolution in this sharp, tactical melee. The king, exposed and surrounded by potential threats, desperately scrambles for safety along the back rank, a last-ditch effort to escape the mating net that has been woven around it. Unleashing a final, piercing check, white forces the black king to a precarious position where it's exposed to relentless pressure and potential mating nets. The immediate plight of the black king, now exposed on the open fifth rank, dictates that all efforts must be bent towards its salvation, rendering any other strategic considerations secondary. A daring dive for the king, sacrificing the rook to tear open pathways and force a decisive confrontation, leaving black with few safe havens. A desperate attempt to survive the onslaught, but the exposed king faces the full fury of the enemy pieces. Sacrificing the rook to force the king into a deadly diagonal, aiming to expose it further. Unleashing the king into the heart of the enemy camp, a desperate gamble to disrupt white's centralized pieces and ignite counterplay. Exposing the black king further, this check aims to disrupt any semblance of defensive structure and force further concessions.